Welcome back. In this episode, we'll get acquainted with anatomy of API calls and understand various authentication and authorization methods for REST APIs. Let's begin. A REST API call has two parts, request and response. A request, depending upon the implementation, would have at least two parts, but it can also have path parameters and query parameters or query string. An API response will always have two parts, response body and response headers. So what are each of these parts? Headers represent the metadata associated with the API request and response. While there are various headers for a REST API call, you will likely come across the following headers more often. Content type indicates the media type of request or response. It tells the server or the client the type of request they are getting. For example, if you receive JSON object as a part of your response, it's highly likely that the response content type is application/JSON. Cache control is the cache policy defined by the server for response. It is usually the part of response header. A cached response can be stored by the client and reused till the time defined by the cache control header. Then comes accept charset. It is a part of request header, and it tells the server about the character sets that are acceptable by the client. And finally, authorization. It carries credential containing the authentication information of the client for the resource being requested. Authorization usually only appears as a part of request header. So after header comes body. Body represents the actual data sent by the client or received from the server. These are the data about the resource. Then we have path parameters. Path parameters are basically a way to specify the resource we are trying to access, whereas query parameters are filter criteria to narrow down the response received from the server. We'll look into path parameters and query string in later videos as well, but in this video we'll look closely into authorization and authentication since they are crucial to the security of the API. So what is authentication and what is authorization? Oftentimes you might have heard the words used interchangeably, but authentication refers to proving correct identity of the user. It defines who the user is. Authorization, on the other hand, defines what are the actions allowed to a user. It defines what a user can do. Both of them go into the request header, but they can also be part of query string or body data. While there are various authentication and authorization methods, the most common authentication methods are HTTP authentication, API key authentication, and OAuth 2.0. OAuth 2.0 is the successor of OAuth 1.0. Let's look into HTTP authentication first. HTTP authentication is any sort of authentication done over HTTP protocol. And there are two types of HTTP authentication. First, basic authentication. Like the name suggests, it's the most straightforward and easiest of them all, and is rarely recommended due to its inherent security vulnerabilities. Because a user has to place their username and password as a part of request header, which can easily be discerned by somebody who has access to the request headers. And in cases where you have to use basic authentication, it should only be done over HTTPS. Bearer authentication, on the other hand, involves security tokens. These security tokens are called bearer tokens. When you have a bearer token in your hand, you should read it as give access to the bearer of this token. Bearer tokens are sent as a part of authorization header. And like basic authentication, they should also be only sent over HTTPS. After HTTP authentication comes API key authentication. This is the most widely used and industry standard for authentication and authorization. API key is a unique value that is generated and assigned to a user by the system or the API provider. This unique value is used to identify the user. While it's not the most secure API authentication method, it can be paired with HTTP authentication to enhance its security. The best practice to use an API key is always to put it in an authorization header. Finally, we have OAuth for authentication and authorization. OAuth 2.0 has two parts, access token and refresh token. Access token basically works like an API key. But unlike API key, OAuth 2.0 is one of the most complex, yet the most secure authentication method in use. To understand what OAuth 2.0 is, you need to understand how it works. So let's take an example to understand this better. Say you want to authorize an image editing app to access all of your photos in Google Photos. When you attempt to log in into the app will send your details like client ID to authorized endpoint and request for an authorization code. If the request is coming from a valid user, the authorized endpoint generates authorization code, sends it back to the image editing app. The image editing app then uses the authorization code and sends it to authorization server to attempt and exchange it with an access token. If the request is validated, the image editing app receives the access token from the authorization server, which it can use to access your Google Photos. Now that we understand OAuth 2.0, let's see the main two parts of OAuth 2.0. As we've already seen, access token is the main key to OAuth 2.0. Access token is like an API key. However, unlike an API key, they can expire. So what do we do when they expire? For that particular reason, we have refresh token. Refresh token are used to retrieve new access token in the event the access token has expired. But how do we implement them? Let's look further. The implementation method of OAuth 2.0 is known as flows, and there are 4 different types of them. First is implicit. Implicit basically returns access token from authorization server without requiring authorization code. So for that reason, it is less secure. Password credentials, on the other hand, send username and password directly to the authorization server. So as you can see, it's not recommended when dealing with third-party vendors. Client credentials use client ID and client secret to request authorization token from the authorization server. And lastly, we have authorization code. It is strongest among them all, and it's also one of the most recommended ones. It sends user details to request authorization code, and then sends the authorization code to the authorization server in order to receive an access token that will be used to make API calls. That brings us to the end of this episode. In the next episode, we'll be looking at URL components of REST API. Until then, stay safe.